Hey everyone, it's Dirk at DPG Off-Road, and we're going to talk today about trimming fenders on your Jeep Cherokee to fit larger tires. There are many different ways to do this. If you're using aftermarket flares like Bushwhacker or a number of different flares that are out there, obviously you're going to need to follow their instructions. They'll supply templates and detailed instructions on exactly where to cut. We're going to talk about the way we've been doing it for over 20 years now. I've lost track of how many Jeep Cherokees I've trimmed personally over the years. We sell a lot of suspension systems for Jeep Cherokees, and I talk to a lot of guys personally about trimming their vehicles and what tire size they're going to run. And I find this is one of the most misunderstood topics after 20 years that is still out there. I don't think it's that complicated, but you know how the internet is. There's so many opinions and so much different information out there. It really gets pretty confusing. So we're going to try to cut through some of that today and make some things clear, and we're going to trim the fenders on a little Project XJ we've got here to fit some bigger tires, and hopefully we can bring some clarity to some of those issues that just seem to be so misunderstood. So you hear a lot of things online. People say, well, I had to trim my fenders to fit 31s, and then another guy says, oh, I have stock suspension, no trimming, I'm running 33s and wheel it hardcore. And well, you get the idea. It's just, people are all over the place. You'll see if you look at internet forums discussing trimming, guys will say, well, you know, every Jeep's different. You might have to trim yours different than I do to fit the same size tire. There's nothing true about that. Every one of these Jeeps, you know, the fender flare that comes off of that 99 XJ came out of the same mold that your 99 XJ flare was molded in. Same thing with the fenders. Now there are differences in model years of Cherokee. When you get 96 and older, that fender well opening was actually larger. It would fit a little bit bigger tire, but once we got to 97 and newer, that fender well opening size got smaller. So the model years are different, but a 96 and another 96 will be the same. A 99 is the same as another 99, but the year models, there's a little more room on the old ones, but if you're gonna run 33s, 35s, have full flex on that Jeep, even on the older ones, you're still gonna have to trim those fenders if you really wanna use it and let that suspension work. I see a lot of objections. People are really concerned, especially if they have a Cherokee that's nicer, lower mileage. Cutting on the Jeep is, you know, can be scary. I've come to find out it's really not that difficult, and now it's not scary at all. Once you get into it and kind of do it, take your time, do it right, it's really not a scary thing. But people will say they don't want to trim the fenders because they don't want to ruin their Jeep. They're afraid it'll ruin it, and there have been some guys that have done some fender trimming that you look at and think, yeah, maybe they did ruin it. It doesn't look very good. And you don't have to do that way. If you trim your fenders correctly, it looks good. It looks clean. There's no reason for it to, you know, to hack it up unless you really just need the clearance and don't care at all about appearances. Again, to each their own on that. But another thing that we find is people are afraid that if they trim the fenders, it's going to promote rust. The Jeep's going to rust faster if they trim the fenders. Now you've got an exposed metal edge or exposed metal that wasn't there before. In my experience over the years, I find that to be very different. I find that your stock Cherokee left alone for 20 years is more likely to rust in the areas of the fender wells and the quarter panels, etc., than if you trim the fenders. So here's a fender flare we took off. I've trimmed half of the project we're going to do today. We're going to do the other side today, but here's a factory fender flare off of a Jeep Cherokee, and these are held in place with these retaining plates. They're just pot metal basically with studs that come through the fender well and bolt in, and you can see here the Jeep looks great. You couldn't see any rust on the outside of the vehicle at all, but we pull that off and you can see there's a lot of rust developing back behind there. So a lot of the trim and the cladding and the body panels on the Jeep, as well as the inner fender liners, can really hold a lot of moisture and grit and dirt and kind of a mud mix up there. And if you're in a state with a lot of snow and salt on the roads, it's even worse. So I've had a lot better success in the long haul with our fenders cut as far as avoiding rust than I ever did with a stock Cherokee. All right, so again, people talk about Jeeps vary wildly, and one Jeep will fit 31s and one will fit 33s in the same model year. And again, like we said, the Jeeps are not different, but what's different, what guys are running into that I don't think is coming across in these discussions, is the parameters are different. So you've got tire diameter, you've got the back spacing on the wheel that you're working with, whether you've trimmed the fenders or not, how much lift you have, what are the shock lengths you're dealing with. There's a number of parameters there that are going to be determined by you on your own Jeep. And then of course, once your parameters are set, the bigger the tire, hopefully the bigger the trimming. Of course, you have to have a certain amount of lift to support a certain tire size and still have some up travel to work with. There's got to be a balance there. On our 2000, this is one of my personal rigs. There's 35-inch tires, and this is our 3.5-inch Super Ultimate Hybrid Kit. It's an Old Man Emu JKS DPG Hybrid package, very popular. But we get full suspension use and flex out of that Jeep. We used to lift our Jeeps much taller back in the old days. It was go big or go home was the mantra. I had a Cherokee with 6.5 inches of lift and 33s. That's just how we did it back then. I rolled that Jeep, totaled it, destroyed it. Learned some important lessons from that. Now I'd much rather have a low center of gravity, wider stance, much more stable, and still have the suspension flex though again to be able to fit that bigger tire and have full use of it. So once we get our parameters set, depending on the tire size and all of those things, then the final thing is to tune your bump stops to your parameters. But again, we want a wider stance on the vehicle. If it's lifted and you've got a taller tire, that Jeep is setting up obviously taller than it was stock. So with the Jeep being taller, we also want to go wider with our stance to offset that height. We've got a higher center of gravity, so the Jeep is easier to tip over, obviously, and I found that out the hard way years ago. So when we go taller, we should go wider at the same time. Now you hear guys saying their 31s rubbed or didn't. Well, if you run 31s on a 97 to 01 Cherokee on stock rims, I've got a buddy that has the same 3.5-inch kit on his 2001. He's got 31-inch tires with stock rims, and he's had that on there for 3, 4, 5 years. I don't know, it's been a while. The tires don't rub, but he never disconnects the sway bar. And he knows that if he's going to go out and disconnect that sway bar and let that suspension flex, that tire, a 31-inch tire, is going to hit that flare. It's going to knock the flare off of it. The only thing that's saving is on the stock rim, that tire, when it goes to flex, like if it's coming up, it'll go up behind the fender a little bit. But as soon as we get that wider stance and move it out, it goes up, it's out more, it'll go up and hit the fender instead of moving in and out behind the fender. That's one of the parameters where guys are having differences of opinion on what you can fit. Maybe 31s work on his and don't work on his. And those are the things to look at, are those parameters. The wheel back spacing, the diameter, all of that is different. And you're gonna have a different result in how it interacts with that fender well when that happens. Some guys I know will run stock wheels and they'll say, well, I'll just get a WJ lower control arm in the front, because if even a 31-inch tire, when you go to steer that tire, the back of that tire being taller is going to reach back deeper and it wants to rub on the lower control arms. And you can get a WJ control arm in there that dips in, and that will solve the rubbing issue with say a 31-inch tire. But it's not getting you any more width. The Jeep isn't wider. It's getting taller, but it's staying skinny, and therefore it's easier to tip over. So I want full lock-to-lock steering. I'd rather move the tire out, but when you move the tire out, it can hit the fender. And I've had guys really struggle, well, which way, how do I do that? For me personally, having rolled the Jeep in an off-camber situation, I want my width. I'd much rather have a wider stance. I've got full lock-to-lock steering without rubbing on the lower control arms, and it's much safer, much more stable. This Jeep is running a 15x8 rim with a 3.5-inch back spacing. The stock Cherokee rim has a 5.25-inch back spacing. So the inside of the rim is moved out 1.75 inches from what it was factory. And then of course it's an 8-inch rim instead of a 7, so you're spreading the outer edge of that tire out a little bit more. And I like that. That's what we want to keep us safe and stable when we're driving these vehicles. So we picked up this little 99 Cherokee project. It's got a 3-inch lift on it already. Two 35/75/15s, about one size bigger than stock. The first thing that just screams to me is, oh my gosh, this poor thing. It needs some help. The wheels just look terrible on there with the lift. The tires look extremely small. And a lot of guys, again, think they could throw a 33s on here, and we're gonna find out here that we can't. So we're gonna put some JK wheels, some takeoffs that we scored off of a recently new Wrangler. JK, very popular swaps on XJs and TJ Wranglers. There's a lot of them out there, a lot of takeoffs. A lot of JK guys are switching up to aftermarket wheels and tires. The market is lousy with them, and they can be bought, especially with a little negotiation, they can be bought very reasonably. There are a couple of pros and cons to doing that, but it is a very popular swap. I found it set at the right price. We're gonna put them on this Jeep. So these are the tires that came off of a late model Rubicon going on this Jeep. So these are a 255/75R17. Which are a load range C tire. That's what we want on a lighter weight vehicle like this. A lot of your bigger 17s and 16s are a load range E when you get into the bigger sizes. But this is just a great tire for this application. The outer diameter of this tire is 32.0. So it's a true 32 inches tall, as opposed to a 32/1150 is probably 31.8 or whatever it is. They're a little shy of 32 most of the time. So this is a pretty healthy size tire to put on this Jeep. I think it's gonna look great when we get it all trimmed, everything's mounted up. All right, we've got our wheel off, our wheel and tire off, and just want to show you a couple of things. This Jeep had 31-inch tires on it on stock rims at one point before these little tires went back on. The problem with that is when you turn, you know, when this wheel turns, you can see on the lower control arm there's a big spot back here where the tire had been rubbing on it. And it just rubs the powder coat off, and that's what happens. You lose some turning radius. You can adjust your steering stops, or you can just back off, but at the end of the day, you're losing your turning radius. So if we go with a wider stance, we can go to full steering lock without rubbing. That's one of the benefits of that, as well as the stability. But on the stock rim with a 31 though, the tire can still move up behind the fender. So the Jeep is tall and skinny, it's easier to tip over, but there's a little more room. That's some of the parameters we were talking about earlier. The tire can move in and out up here a little better, but as soon as we get that wider stance that we want, now instead of being able to fit up behind there, it comes up and hits the flares much sooner. If you want to have the stability and full lock-to-lock steering, you need to go wider. This is our only problem. And once you've warmed up to the idea that fender trimming is okay and you're committed to running bigger tires with full function steering, full flex, as soon as you're ready to trim the fenders, you're home free. Everything is good at that point. But we're going to throw this other wheel back on here just to demonstrate the kind of room that you have or don't have without trimming. Okay, we're going to talk a minute about JK wheels and wheel spacers. These Jeeps have a 5-on-4.5-inch bolt pattern, but the JK wheels that are popular to put on these Jeeps have a 5-on-5. So you got a 5-inch spacing on your lug pattern as opposed to a 4.5. So the wheels will not bolt up. We have to use a wheel spacer adapter to put these wheels on your XJ or TJ, Cherokee or Wrangler. This is another point that we see mistakes made on, is how thick of a wheel spacer do we need to achieve what we want to achieve. Earlier we talked about on my Cherokee, I've got a 8-inch rim with a 3.5-inch back space, and I think that's great. I'm looking for anywhere from a 3¼ inch to a 3.75 inch back spacing as optimum to give us that wider stance. Anywhere in that range I'm happy with. Well, the most commonly sold spacer for this conversion is 1¼ inch thick. And people think, well, that should be plenty, that'll move me out, that'll get me wider. And they don't realize the back spacing on the JK wheel is not the same as your XJ or your TJ Wrangler. They're very different. That's why we see people take a 16-inch Rubicon Moab wheel. Those are popular. They throw them on the older Cherokees or Wranglers. Then they try to put a 285 or close to a 33-inch tire, and they find out that they're rubbing hard on the control arms. The stance is too narrow. That is a 5-inch back space on a 16-inch Moab. So the JK wheel has a 6¼ inch back space, and what that means, the back spacing is the distance from the mounting surface here, where it sets up or mounts up against the rotor, to the inside edge of the rim. That distance from here to here is the back spacing. And on a JK wheel, it is much deeper. You can see that's way back there, which means when you mount it up, the tire is going to sit much deeper in than a typical 15-inch wheel that we'd be looking for. So if you take an 1¼ inch spacer and put it on a 6¼ inch back space, you end up, your net effective back spacing is 5 inches. That is exactly the same as a 16-inch Moab wheel, which is too narrow to put on these Jeeps by itself with a 285, 75, 16, for example. It's just way too narrow. So an 1¼ inch spacer is not going to do it. The thinner the spacer, the cheaper it is, but if it doesn't move it out far enough, you're back to having the same problem. So we went with a 3-inch spacer, and again, you want to factor that in. If you're looking at JK wheels, you're going to have to buy a spacer adapter. I'd be looking at a 2.5 to 3-inch spacer. So, for example, if that's 6¼ and I put a 3-inch spacer, my net effective back spacing now is 3¼ inch. So somewhere in that 3¼ to 3.75 inch range, a 2.5 to 3-inch spacer, if I want to mimic what we get out of a common 15-inch wheel, then that's what we're going to need, is 2.5 to 3 inches of spacer to make that happen. Some people think, well, that's awful hard on my ball joints, and well, it's not any harder than the same 15-inch wheel with a 3¼ to 3.75 inch back spacing. It's just we're bolting two pieces together to equal that same distance. The Jeep does not know the difference in strain on any of the components. People think it's hard on wheel bearing hubs, and technically, you know, the wider it is, the more leverage that's on it, technically. But practically speaking, after 20 plus years of building and wheeling these Jeeps, I can tell you that a 3.75, 3.5 inch backspace we've been running with 33s and 35s for over 2 decades. The only hub failures I have seen on any of our crew or people that we run with are hubs that have been underwater, that have been submerged. Maybe a Jeep got stuck and had to get left there for a while. That wheel bearing hub in there, they call it a sealed unit, but it is not. It will take on moisture. Those are the only ones I've seen fail. All of our other vehicles that have not been submerged like that, we'd be wheeling, and there was a time we wheeled every weekend, every Saturday we'd be on the trails all day long, and we just never had hub failures. I replaced the wheel bearing hubs on one of my Cherokees at 190,000 miles, and I just did it because we were rebuilding the front end, but the hubs were working fine at that point. So I think that's really the difference, in my opinion, is whether they've been submerged, moisture's got in. Moisture in a moving part, it'll kill it sooner rather than later. So I don't find the extra strain to be anything, and certainly these two items bolted together don't equal any more strain than the one-piece wheel of the same back spacing and width. So we're going to go ahead and throw these on and set this down and just see what this looks like without trimming. Okay, so we've thrown our wheels and spacers on here just without trimming, just so you can see what we're dealing with here. very little room here. And some people would look at that and say, hey, I think that'll work. Your suspension's still going to move up and down, and the tires are still going to turn. And there's just very little room here. If you try to drive this, even on the street, you turn into a steep driveway with that one tire, it's going to knock that flare right off the Jeep. If you've ever seen a lifted XJ running around with a little bit bigger tires and one or two flares are missing, that's what happened. So we don't want that. We want to have full function. We want to have full flex, so the tires and full steering function. The tires should never ever rub on the fenders under any circumstances. If they do, your parameters need to be changed, or you need to tune the bump stop accordingly so they don't hit. Also, you can see here too, and on the front of the fender especially, when the tires turn the other way, I couldn't even get the handle of a screwdriver in between the tire and the flare in the front. But there's a lot more room here than there is down low. That's where our issue is. So when we're making room through fender trimming, the bigger priority is to make room down here on the lower portions of the fender well, because the bigger the tire is, the closer it gets to this. Some people ask, can they just keep the stock flares and trim the flares, or can they move the flares up? These flares don't move very well. There's not I wouldn't want to use that pot metal rusty plate that's back there for one thing, and there's just not a lot of material there to remount the factory flare. And even if you moved it up, you're still not making this bigger, which is the problem. And you've got body lines that the flare follows it that mount it, and as you move it up, it's all screwed up. So I don't like that idea. If you really think you have to have a flare, which again, that's up to you, I would do an aftermarket. Spend the money, get an aftermarket flare. There are some people that really just have to have that. I will say this, there are people that think they want flares to keep mud off of their Jeep. Good luck with that. You got a wider stance. Even if you had a flare that was way out here, which I don't like either because it makes my bigger tires look kind of small again, but even if you did, as we lift that vehicle, we're pulling that tire down out of the fender well. That tire is going to throw mud right past your flares and all up the side of the Jeep anyway. So you would have to have super monster flares and some really big gnarly mud flaps that would be flapping and dragging all over stuff to start to keep some mud off that vehicle. So I wouldn't worry too much. Personally, I don't like mud. I've been there and done that, got that out of my system. $20, $30, $40 a trip at the car wash doesn't sound real attractive. And there's not a lot of traction there. I'd much rather go wheeling when the trails are dry and we can actually climb some obstacles with some traction. But this is the point we want to make, is we need room down here, and you can't just trim plastic. You've got to get in there and trim metal if you want to make more room for a bigger tire. So we're going to pull these tires off, put the stock ones back on just because it's easier to work in there that way. And we're going to start on this fender trim, show you what that looks like the way that we do. All right, so on our fender trimming for our Cherokee, these are an assortment of some of the tools you're going to want to have available for you. We're going to go ahead and do it now that we've got those wheels off. We're just going to leave them off, have more room to work in the fender well, but you're going to want to have a ratchet or power tools to remove the wheels, a hand ratchet, a regular ratchet, or we're going to use an air ratchet in the fender well to get those bolts off that hold the trim on. When it comes to actually cutting the metal in your fenders, people have used all kinds of stuff, from a Sawzall, a Dremel tool, an angle grinder, a body saw, a number of different things out there that will work. What I wouldn't use is a Sawzall, and trust me on that, you'll find out the hard way. I can't cut straight in this scenario for some reason. It just wants to drift on me when I'm trying to cut around a full fender. And that's in the rear. In the front, that is a single piece of sheet metal. If you try to cut that with a Sawzall, the blade will grab it and just flap the whole fender. So I wouldn't use a Sawzall. You can use a Dremel tool if you want to, but it's gonna be slow. And you'll need the little fiberglass reinforced cutoff wheels. And honestly, as many of those little wheels as it would take to do that, you could just go down to Harbor Freight and buy a cheap angle grinder that will actually cut that metal a lot faster. That's what that or the body saw, a couple of my favorite tools for actually doing that cutting on the vehicle. I like the body saw for cutting the plastic on the fender bumperettes, the end pieces. I also want some flat discs, some sanding discs. I use a real coarse, 40 grit, maybe 35 grit to shape that plastic on the bumperette. So it's pretty aggressive, but it takes off that material and kind of shapes it in pretty quickly to get to that initial place that I'm looking for. You may want some tape if you want to run a tape line, some masking tape to mark a line that you want to cut. Of course, if you're cutting metal, you want to have some eye protection available, some spray paint to dress up the edges that you cut. Also, I like to clean up the fender wells when we're all done, ultimately or eventually, clean them out and spray paint flat black in the fender wells just to touch that up. It makes it look better. When you're pulling the bumperettes off, you'll need a 10 millimeter, an 8 millimeter, and a 1/4 inch driver to remove the bolts and screws that hold those little bumper covers on. You need two 10 millimeters, 1/8 and 1/4 inch. I like to use a little battery impact. When we finish our fenders out, we use protecto-trim, and this is real important. That's what's on this Cherokee over here. It's just a fender well band molding we've been using again for 20 years. They make a lot of different sizes and configurations of this. I have looked at and sampled pretty much everything out there. This is my favorite. It's a 5/8 inch wide band molding with the good 3M gray stuff on the back, and it just sticks on and stays there. We may have to break out another roll. I've already done some fender trimming with this one. We've got a little bit left. Protecto-trim, you can find that on the website also, dpgoffroad.com, in the exterior section. Protecto-trim, for you guys that are interested in that, that's available there. So we are going to go ahead and disassemble the flares, remove that stuff, start trimming and getting this Jeep ready for our bigger tires. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and remove the factory flares and the inner fender liner. From here, there's a 5 or 6, I think, 10 millimeter nuts. So you want to have I like to use a 1/4 inch drive, deep 10 millimeter socket. We're going to use an air ratchet, obviously it's just faster. We're going to remove each of those little bolts and pull that flare off. These actually came off, surprisingly. A lot of these are rusted enough that little stud will just snap instead of the nut coming off, which is fine with me. It's just that much less time that you're unscrewing all these nuts. If they break, that's good. We're not going to reuse those anyway. So we're going to go ahead and remove the rest of these and pull this flare off. All right, so we removed our retaining nuts from the fender flare retaining plates, and we removed the hardware from this body cladding back here. These are all 10 millimeter nuts going around there. There's a screw on the bottom of the fender flare here in the front, and another one, you'll see a little hole here. Both of those ended up being 1/4 inch drive. It's very small. You don't want too fat of a socket or it won't even go up in there. We've taken that off, taken this out of here. There's also another bolt and nut back here on the bottom. You'll have to get underneath to see it, but you'll need a wrench and a socket, or 2 wrenches, whatever the case may be, to get that out to release that body molding piece. All of that is out, so we're going to go ahead and pull this loose. We've got our inner liner again, just that goes on the inner portion there. That's that's another area that holds dirt and moisture that I don't like. We're going to pull our flare off, and there you go, case in point. Perfect example of, you think your Cherokee is rust free, and you find out that if these had been trimmed and the way we do it a long time ago, that wouldn't be there today. So this traps a lot of moisture and dirt and stuff in there. We'll clean it up and see how bad it is, and some of it's going to get cut out, but certainly it will look a lot better than this when we get finished. But classic case of why the factory flares and body moldings and stuff are, you think you're doing yourself a favor by not trimming to promote rust, and then you see this. All right, so that's off. We've got our screw out of the bottom here and the bolt out, so once that's off, this piece just slides straight back and comes off. And we've got a few rocks and stuff in there. And there you see, we've got some rust in that rear quarter. Again, if your Jeep does this, I wouldn't be alarmed. This is not unusual, but this is what carrying this factory stuff does. It promotes rust. So there's a couple of things you can do here. One is just go. Just trim it, trim this, put it back on and go. You could clean that up and put a low buck patch on there if you wanted to, with just some sheet metal, other material, and some sealant. You could replace it professionally in a body shop, which would be a lot more expensive. Personally, on a 20-year-old vehicle, I don't know how many would consider that worth it. What we did on my Cherokee, I had the same situation on just the passenger side. I didn't know it was there. I was going to take this little piece off here and just go with an older Cherokee bumper that would just come around and stop right here and let that be open. But when I found the Cancer in mine, we did a cut and fold, which a lot of you have probably seen or are familiar with, and that's where we basically cut and section this whole area out and take the Cancer out, cut it, and fold it up so that basically all that is gone when you're done. I've got an OR Fab bumper on my Cherokee that wraps around underneath there for protection. There's more clearance and more room rearward for bigger tires anyway, so those are all things that you could do if you have this happen on your Cherokee. Again, this is structural, but that's not a big deal as far as the reliability of the vehicle or the lifespan of the vehicle. This vehicle, other than some rust in these rear areas, this little Cherokee's in great shape. Low mileage, everything looks good, but you just see what happens when you have this. And we're not going to deal with this. That's another project for another day. We're going to do some sheet metal work and clean that up, but for now we're going to go ahead and move on with our fender trimming and act like that's not there for the moment. All right, let's clean this up and see what we've got. All right, so we've got our flares and body molding off and kind of wiped this down and cleaned it up. When we're trimming the rear just moves up and down for the most part. It doesn't have to steer, so you don't need to trim as much in the rear as you would in the front, theoretically, for that reason. There are some different ways that I've seen people do this. For me personally, there are spot welds. I don't know if you can see them. I'm just gonna draw. There's an inner fender well and an outer skin, and they're spot welded together. And these are your spot welds if you can't see them in the video there. These are the spot welds, and these are structural points. These are actually holding this vehicle together. So we don't want to cut those out. If you cut the spot weld, if you cut up above the spot welds, you're only gaining a little bit of room, but you're going to have to re-weld that. That body is going to split apart if you do that. Now, they're not always real super consistent, so sometimes depending on where I'm cutting, I might take one or two out. But for the most part, we want to leave the spot welds in there for structure. Now, I'll see people come in and they want to have every little bit. I would personally rather just have a little bit of extra bump stop and not over compress the spring. So I just cut up right to the bottom of the spot welds, and it leaves a pretty good margin right there for that 5/8 band molding to cover the rest. That works well, I like that. Some people will slit. They'll put slits in this whole thing all the way around, and they do a slit and fold or cut and fold on the fender well. They make lots of slits and they bend that up. And boy, if you don't like rust, you really don't want to do that, because every one of those slits, and then you bend that up, there's a cavity in there to catch mud and dirt and moisture, and that could promote some big rust pretty quickly in some of these vehicles. So I just don't see the need for it. We just cut again right along the bottom of the spot welds. So we're going to go ahead and get the grinder out and make our initial cuts. I've done this long enough that I really don't even make a pattern. I like to leave a little bit. I'll cut along the bottom. I'd rather leave a little extra and go back and feather it in with my grinder and a flat disc than I would to cut too far. The good news about the 5/8 band molding is you've got the better part of a 5/8 inch margin for error. So even if you can't cut straight, once you lay that molding back down on there, it's just a nice finished look when it's done. So let's go ahead and make this first cut on this rear fender. All right, we're going to go ahead and make our first cut and take this edge off this fender wheel. Okay, so We've made an initial cut here. That's about all we want to take off the way we do it. And so we're just going to clean this up here and just pull this loose metal loose here. Again, this is just our initial rough cut. Then we'll get a flat disc and come in here and smooth this out and shape it just exactly to where we want it. And we'll be almost to where we need to be in this rear one. Okay, we're going to go ahead and use a flat disc now and kind of clean this up and shape. Again, I like to leave it long and then come back in and shape it instead of cutting too far in the first time. So we're just going to clean this up here a little bit and get it smoothed out and ready for some trim. So we've got this rust in here and we don't have time to do any body work or professional grade stuff. I'm going to shoot a little paint on it and we're going to go ahead and trim it out just like we normally would, just so you can see the finished effect for the video. We'll go back in and worry about what we're going to do with this later. I think I want to do a little some sort of body work in there, some metal work, and replace some of that. But for now, we'll get it cleaned up, get some trim on it, get everything put back together, so you can kind of see. A lot of guys will trim their fenders and leave that rough edge, and it really doesn't look good with the holes and just the rough cut. But once we lay that protecto-trim on there, it really changes the appearance and cleans that whole fender up. Looks much better when it's done. All right, let's go to the front. Okay, we're going to pull this front fender well apart, and again, this is very simple. First thing I want to do is get this fender liner out of here. Again, we're not going to reuse it. I don't want it. It's just another layer of stuff to catch moisture, although I'd be surprised if we had any rust behind this to speak of. But this is just held in place with little push pins, and you could use a trim tool and pop the pins out, but I don't know, I always just kind of grab it and pull it and just get it out of there. So we're going to work this loose and just pull this inner liner out. See, our flare's already coming off. So there's that inner fender liner. We're just going to take that out and get rid of that. And this is one of the things, there's not a whole lot of meat there that's holding these flares on, and if a tire catches it, it knocks it off. It has these little retaining little nipples on the plastic that hold it, and once it pops off, they never stay on there again after that. We'll probably just take that off just like that. You see those clamping plates? Again, they hold all kinds of mud and moisture in there. I like that a lot better to just get rid of that. We've got one screw, which I think right now we'll just take that off. That thing is, there we go. So that's off. And then we're gonna remove our 10mm nuts, take these plates off, clean that up, and then we're gonna trim the front. Taking the liner out first makes it a little easier to see these. One of our retaining plates. Off of there. See all that mud that's just been laying in there Fortunately, this looks real good here, but it's just a matter of time when you have moisture and mud laying up inside those panels that sooner or later it's going to win. There's another thing when you pull the inner liner out, there's this little foam piece in here that is supposed to be an insulation between the fender well liner and the door, but it's really just a joke. It's just flopping around, it's not sealed. I've never seen one of these that was sealed. They're just laying in there, rattling around basically and doing nothing. There's another thing in here. If you look up, once this liner and stuff comes out, there's a little bracket here that bolts through one of the plates. It's supposed to give the fender some rigidity. We're going to be cutting that up here. Don't want or need it anymore, so it's just basically riveted up inside the fender there. And again, just real easy, just pull that right out of there, and we don't need that either. We'll continue taking, we got one more nut and this plate will be off. All right, so we've got that off, and we're gonna wipe this up and clean it off just a little bit. See, this is in a whole lot better shape than the back was. It's just full of mud. Now, depending on the tire size that you're gonna fit, this could be cut in a couple of different ways. I always do it the same way. I like to cut on that top line that's right here on the fender. If I was running 31s, maybe 32s, and I didn't think I might go to 33s later on, I've seen, and I have done it, where we'll cut on this second line here, and it leaves a little bit of a outward bent piece of the fender. Every time I've done that, I found we end up going to a bigger tire later, and I end up going back in and cutting it back up even further. So it doesn't make a lot of difference anymore. I just go ahead and cut right on that first line. I used to just cut this without it, but if your paint is lighter, or depending on the lighting you're working with, you may want to make a line just so you can see it better. If it was a dark paint, you could use a silver Sharpie, for example. But I like to just lay that right on that line that I'm going to cut, and just make a line that I can see better. The older I get, the worse my eyes get, but I can just see that a lot better than I can with the paint. So we're going to come around like this is our cut line, and then again, we don't need as much room on the top as we do on the ends. So once we round these corners, once I get back in here, I'm going to start sweeping this cut back down into this area. We're going to go clear underneath this structure and take this first bolt out. There's a bolt under here. There's two bolts down here, but this first one that clamps this together, we're going to take all that structure out. This is real important to make room, not only here, but underneath. We're going to take some of this structure right out, right under here. And so we're going to sweep this back more as we go, just to get a kind of a rough idea, I suppose. I think I'll just play it safe, and we'll kind of come back about like that. I can always feather it back with my grinder. You only get one shot at this. We can always take more metal off, but it's a lot harder to put metal back. So then we're going to go underneath and cut that down and take that bolt out. So all that structure is going to come out. We'll go ahead and make some cuts here. All right, so I've got my line drawn here for our first cut that we're going to make. We're going to go ahead and take this piece of metal out. It's going to open it up quite a bit more so that tire can move and flex and steer and not be running into anything. By the way, on late model Cherokees, we want to be careful. One reason we don't want to cut higher than that is your washer bottle is back here for your windshield washer fluid, and we don't want to cut into above where that's exposed because it just looks terrible and there's not more room coming from that. So we want to cut right on that line and don't run the wheel through too deep. You shouldn't run into it, but I just try to cut kind of shallow, go through there, and no higher than that because that washer bottle's back there. All right, so now we can start to get an idea of how much more room we're getting. And again, that's why we want to go underneath here. And I'm going to come up the back side and we're going to cut across there and take that out. And you can see now too why we want to trim these bumper caps as well, because we want that all that room all the way through. I see guys online and on the internet, you'll see a lot of trim fenders and they took these bumper caps off. And you can do that and the room is there, obviously it's just a piece of plastic, but it sure looks better with that on. And we're just gonna cut that right down under there and take that strip out of the way and just make more room, but it can still look good. You don't have to yank that off of there and ruin how it looks at the same time. So I'm gonna get this little piece out of here and trim this down here, and we'll start doing some trimming on the bumperette end covers, and we'll be ready to lay down some paint and trim, and this project will be ready to go. This is another little tight spot here that's hard to get the grinder in. The body shop saw works real well for getting in places like this. Nice for that little spot right there. Okay, so we've cut all this out and we've got this piece under here. Again, your tire that's very critical. You don't want to just stop here. You want to get this structure out underneath and make this room under here. So we're going to go ahead and cut down through here and take that out. Take this first bolt out that's under there. All right, so that's taken out some of that material all the way around under the bottom of that fender. And now we're going to go back in with our flat disc and clean this up. You can see how much more room we made now and why we have to trim the bumper end caps so that we can continue that contour on down. So I'm going to go ahead and make my first rough cut on this bumper cover. You can see how much room we gained by cutting the fender. I'm just going to make a first cut. We'll come back and shape it again. I find a 35 grit flat disc works really good for the final shaping after we've cut this. But I'm just going to make a first cut to kind of get this piece out of the way before I start sanding on the fender. And I'll see a lot of these cuts go a lot of different ways. Some guys will just go down and leave all of this. In this case, we're going to cut underneath here a little bit, kind of taper it down in the front. But that's just our first rough cut to get that out of the way. And we'll kind of shape this and conform it. The end goal here is when it's done to have this plunging down and flow into that bumperette cover and all as one piece. As long as it flows away from it, it's okay. You just don't want it to come down and then have this part flowing back, kind of like it is now. So we've got our rough cuts done. Now we'll do some final shaping and get ready to finish this up. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and clean up this fender. I've made my cut. That one I make right on the line. I know that's right where I want it. I'm just gonna clean this up. A lot of it on the inside. We've got a lot of loose, sharp metal under here, and I want to get that out of there. So we're gonna take that edge down and then kind of run our flat disc back there to smooth that up. Basically when it's done, I should be able to run my finger over it and not have any metal hanging. It should just be smooth. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the fender, and then we'll move on to shaping all that together. Now we're getting to the point where we want to start doing our final shaping and contouring. Now I'm looking for a certain line, a certain contour, And for this, I normally like to do these outdoors where I can get in the sunlight and I can get way back off of the vehicle. Because I want to get back away from it, and I want to look at this line and see whether I need to take some more off here, where I need to contour this, as well as this. I'm looking for just a nice sweeping line. I think I'm going to have to take some more material off down here on the bottom. But we just want that to kind of flow as far as the general shape goes. Once I have that, I can take some more material off. Once I have that, I'll smooth that out nice and smooth. And then we'll put some paint on that edge and lay our trim down, and that is done. All right, so we've got this trimmed and kind of cleaned up again for the purposes of the video to get a final result. You can see here where this still extends into the fender well. So we're going to trim that, cut that back, and I'm going to be generous here, and then I can come back in and sand it down to the place that I want it. But we're going to cut that off and then do that right now. So we'll pull that right back off and work on that. Okay, so I've cut the end off of this, and now we're just going to shape it. I like to be careful. You need a little bit more off the ends than you want in the middle. So I'm just going to kind of shape this. Again, a 35 grit flat disc works real well, just kind of works real quick. And so it's going to shape that into where I kind of want it, where it kind of works with that. You don't want it back too far because it exposes the metal, and we still want, from a side view, for it to look aesthetically as good as it can. So we're just going to shape this a little bit more. And again, we just work that a little bit at a time until we see a contour that looks good and covers it up, but doesn't stick too far back in the fender well, but doesn't go back too far to expose a lot of that metal back there either. So I think I kind of like that right where, about where it's at. Okay, so we've got our fenders smoothed out. Like to go back on the back side where it's nice and smooth. We don't have metal hanging up. Everything's smooth to the shape that we want it. We've got our contour, which again, I like to go, it's not a good day outside, but normally I go outside and get way back off of this where I can see the flow of the fender lines that I'm looking for. And again, the front bumper, we just went all the way around, took the air dam completely off, shaved all that away. Again, that's just I think it might be a little more aesthetic, a little better ground clearance. There's no air dam there or spoiler that didn't need to be there anyway. So number of ways you can do it. Of course, if you have an aftermarket bumper, you're replacing that. Most of those are built to have more clearance anyway. However you want to configure that. Some guys take it off. Personally, I think it just looks a lot cleaner. If you're not doing an aftermarket bumper, just go ahead and cut that and trim it. It just looks a whole lot cleaner when it's done. But we've got our painted edge, or our unpainted edge, where we've cleaned that. So you just want to shoot a little flat black paint on any raw edges there that are showing. But I don't shoot the outside. I like to use a rag and just get it good and wet, and just come around those lines and just get them good and painted. I just keep a wet rag and just keep running that around there and get that edge painted up. Again, there's no more, that's just going to be all there is there, so there's no pockets or body trim or panels or anything to hold moisture. In 20 years I'm doing this, once we're at this point, we just don't have rust issues with this. With these panels like this, it's all good at that point. So that's really all the protection we need. Again, your mileage may vary. If you want to do that a different way, that's just the way that we've done it for 2 decades now. So we'll get that on there, let that dry, and then we'll lay down our protecto-trim to finish that out cosmetically, and we're good to go. Okay, we've got our wheels and tires back on. Everything's kind of smoothed out, and we've painted our edges. We had that rust in here, so we kind of, for now, went up there and covered that up a little more. But we're going to apply our protecto-trim. I've got a piece pre-cut. This stuff, again, love this stuff, but I like to use just a little blade cutter like that. And we're going to go down here and mimic that angle that we're going to run that at and cut that off so that when we put it on there, we've got the the right angle on there, and then we'll just get that tape peeled back a little bit. This has the 3M brand super sticky gray tape. Once you put this on there, it's not coming off. I mean, you can take it off, but we'll have to really take it off. It doesn't just fall off. I like to do this in warmer weather because the warmer it is, the more flexible this stuff is. But we're literally just gonna lay it on here, get our edge down here where we want it. And we're gonna take a fender well that's fairly ugly and has holes in it. And this is really just cleans it up. Very inexpensive product. And we're just gonna lay it on there and start running it around the edge of this fender well. A lot of people ask about this stuff. Does it have a lip on the bottom of it? And the answer is no, it does not. And I don't really want it to. And of course, we didn't have this little rusty area. This would be a lot cleaner here. It's just a flat band molding, and I just let the edge of the band molding become the bottom edge. Again, you've got a lot of leeway here if you screw up your cut. Okay, we're gonna put our front trim on this fender. Again, just got my cut kind of angled where I want it. Our paint's dry, we're gonna lay this down. Very simple. Just stick that down here to get our starting point. And we just run it on around. Again, I wish I had better light in the outdoors to do it, but the weather just wasn't cooperative today. But we're gonna lay that on around again. I'm just kind of feeling with my thumb where the metal is and running that where it just hangs over the edge just a tiny bit. So you got a nice clean edge when it's all done. Bring it on down. One thing and this is one of the reasons I don't want a lip that bends around the corner. For one thing, we know that anything that slides over that fender or has a lip, there's just more potential for rust. I just prefer this. It's just nice and clean. Nothing's gonna catch in there. And if there's no other bends in the material, if it's flat, it conforms easier. If it had a 90-degree bend and you try to bend it, it doesn't want to bend very well. So this, when we come to this corner here, we can just come down and literally form that product right into the bend and just follow it. I remember a friend of mine did this years ago, and he cut that in pieces and it didn't look good, and really don't need to do that. This just bends right around there, and I like to work it a little bit, especially, you know, it's February 1st here, and fairly nice day temperature wise for February, but still not real hot by any means. So I like to just give it time and work it around there. And then the same thing when we get down here, we're just gonna make our slash cut on the end where we want that. So we'll take the rest of our backing off and just run that right on down to the bottom. And there we are. So it just follows right around the curves. Again, cleans all that up. Even if you cut it crooked, you've got a 5/8 inch margin there that you can hide your mistakes with. And right there, we've got a nice clean fender well. Plenty of room for that tire that we didn't have before. Now we can turn lock to lock. We've got a nice wide stance so we don't rub our control arms, but we also won't be hitting any fenders now either. So that's the whole reason we do that. Full function, full steering, full articulation. Again, if you never disconnect your sway bar, and then the suspension won't flex as much, you don't have to trim as much. But I've had guys tell me, well, I only go off-road like once a year or twice a year. And folks, that's all it takes for that tire to knock that flare off. And if you go off-road ever, even one time, disconnect the sway bar and let that suspension work, there's just no reason for the tires to ever come in contact with the fenders. So now our parameters are set. We've got the stance, the back spacing, the diameter, the lift, all the things that, well, we'll be doing some more work to this project. But once all those parameters are set, then we want to go out and flex that Jeep and tune the bump stops so that the tires are stopped hard by the bump stops, either just before the tire can hit the fender or just before the shock is fully bottomed out. One or the other. Some people want to try to twist it up on a floor jack without wheels. I'm going to go out and take it out on a ramp, an obstacle of some sort, and actually flex this Jeep and let it tell me how much bump stop it needs or wants for that particular set of parameters that we've put into it. Okay, we have completed our fender trimming project on this little 99 Cherokee. We've got all our trim on, wheels and tires are on. Big difference in how this Jeep looks. Looks a lot better than it did before, especially with those little tiny gold wheels and tires on there. But a couple of points I want to point out. In the front, we've taken that fender liner out, and there's a space back here that you can see in the fender well. A lot of us just don't worry about it. There's no water that's coming in the cab. Your door seals still work there. But if you wanted to, you could get in here. Back in the day, we used swimming pool noodles, the foam pool noodles. Of course, they were yellow and neon pink and electric green and whatnot. A customer of mine sent me a link recently for some pipe insulation, but it was kind of a dark gray foam tube. And what we would do is just put that in this area here, and I'd take my sanding disc and shave the end however I needed to get it to fit in the bottom. And I'd make sure my fender well was really clean, and then I'd just press that tube in and run it up and over and butt it up against the washer bottle on this side and really create a seal in there. If you really wanted to, again, most guys don't do that, but if you really want to get the ultimate in soundproofing, waterproofing, if there is such a thing on one of these, you can do that. Once it's in there and setting where I want it and kind of shaved into place, I would just take some black polyurethane sealant and run a bead down each side of the tube in the fender well, and I like to just push it in there with my fingers or thumbs and set it so that it seals that foam tube inside there. Again, completely optional if you want to. I kind of don't do it anymore. I just don't really see a benefit there. But we also have, again, now so much more room. Remember, on the front of this, when we had that factory, I could not wedge that screwdriver handle in between there. That's how tight that was. Now, I can get the whole screwdriver in there. So we've got a whole lot more room between that tire and fender than we had before. Now we don't worry about it. If we want to go off-road and pull the disconnects and twist this thing up fully, no worries. Lock-to-lock steering, full flex, we're good to go. We've got plenty of room. And you know, with a 3-inch lift, when we trim the fenders, it looks like the Jeep has more lift than it really does, because lifting a Jeep creates a bigger gap between the tire and the fender. Well, so does making the fender bigger. So rather than lifting a Jeep taller, higher center of gravity, easier to tip over, all of our operating angles on everything, drive shafts, control arms, track bars, steering linkages, everything, the taller you lift it, the steeper those angles get. Your handling starts getting twitchy and sketchy. Ride quality suffers. You start having to spend more money, maybe at a certain point, on long arms and drive shaft modifications, slip yoke eliminator. We keep the lift smaller, make more room in the fenders, much better, much more stable, lower center of gravity. This is the way that we do it now. 6.5 inches of lift for 33s. We just, you know, to each their own. If that's what a guy wants to do, we don't do that anymore. We keep these as low as we can. I'm running a 3.5-inch kit with 35-inch tires on my 2000. Much more stable. The Jeeps we build now are run circles around those big giant behemoths we were building 15 and 20 years ago. So hopefully that helps you. Hopefully that gives you some ideas, some tips. You might vary this a little bit on your own rig. At the end of the day, these are the things you need to do to make room for bigger tires on your Cherokee. This is Dirk from DPG Off-Road. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.